thank you so much for coming. So this talk is what Catholics and anybody else want to consider in casting their vote in this election or in any election in the foreseeable future. And so we're going to look at that with regard to the Church's social doctrine, because that's what ought to guide us in how we cast our vote and in the morality of that decision. Right? Because we have the privilege of electing our president, our representatives, and that's not a small thing, right? So there's a moral dimension that we ought to consider in casting our vote. And so I can't tell you who to vote for, but that would be too easy. What much more important is the principles that we ought to consider in casting our vote, right? And therefore the platform that we would want to vote for, and the platform we must not vote for. All right, that's the idea. And I'm going to focus on 5 points. And so the first one is the difference between absolute moral norms, like thou shalt not murder, and prudential decisions. Because a lot of times those two things get confused. Right? So there are certain issues that really are black and white. And then there are other issues that are completely gray. Right? And it's really important to distinguish. That's first thing. Second thing, the right to life, we'll look at. Religious liberty, and defense of marriage as established by God. And then how to help the needy and the poor. And we'll look at, in other words, how to exercise solidarity. And there's a key principle we're going to look at called subsidiarity, which I'll explain, which means we want to help people on the local level. Right? So those are the 5 things we're going to look at. Let's start with the first thing, which is the difference between prudential decisions that are gray and absolute moral norms that really are black and white. Okay, in other words, not every issue is equally important. We have to make a hierarchy of issues and put first things first. There's a huge difference between non-negotiables and negotiables. And the difference is this, that non-negotiables, all right-thinking people ought to agree on. But prudential decisions, good people are going to disagree, and that's okay. Right? So what's the basis of absolute moral norms? Right? The basis is that man is made in the image and likeness of God. And therefore, every human being has a dignity that comes from God and reflects to God, and that dignity is the basis of any rightly ordered society. And so anything that strikes at the root of the fundamental dignity of every human person strikes at the root of any rightly ordered society, and strikes therefore at the root of every other good that the society cherishes. Right? Now, because there's this, because of our dignity as made in the image of God, that's the basis for absolute moral norms. They're absolute moral norms because that dignity can't be violated. What is an absolute moral norm? It's something that, a norm that can't be violated no matter what the circumstances. Thou shalt not murder is something that we can't break no matter what the circumstance. There's never going to be a good circumstance that's going to justify murder. Right? And the same thing goes for, there's never going to be a good circumstance that justifies adultery, theft, etc. Whether something's theft or not, we can discuss. But if it's theft, you can't do it. Right? So that's an absolute moral norm. And you can see it's the very nature of an absolute moral norm that it's black and white. Right? It's something that you don't have to examine the circumstances to know if you can do it. You might have to examine to know whether it is murder. But once you come to the conclusion that's an innocent human person, then it's clear. All right? And John Paul II heroically defended the existence of absolute moral norms not too long ago in a great encyclical called Veritatis Splendor, the splendor of the truth. And the purpose of this encyclical was to to authoritatively state that there are absolute moral norms. They exist. And that means there are certain things you can't ever do, no matter what the circumstances. And so John Paul II says this. He says, quote, "Reason attests that there are objects of human acts which by their very nature can't be ordered to God, because they radically contradict the good of the person made in his image." Right? So killing an innocent, you can't ever do it for the glory of God. Right? It can't be ordered to God. God doesn't ever want that. And these are the acts that the church calls intrinsically evil. They are always and per se evil on account of their object, quite apart from our intentions and quite apart from the circumstances. Right? And what are some examples? Well, the Second Vatican Council gave some examples. Any kind of homicide, genocide, abortion, euthanasia, voluntary suicide, anything that violates the integrity of the human person, like mutilation, physical or mental torture, attempts to coerce the spirit, slavery, prostitution, trafficking in women and children. These things are unspeakable crimes. Right? So that's the Second Vatican Council, and John Paul II quoting it. Right? So that's absolute moral norms are what defend us from those evils. Okay? All right, so let's shift and look at the other kind of thing, a prudential decision. What's a prudential decision that good people can disagree on? And that's how to do the good that we want to do. Right? We're told not only to avoid evil, that's our absolute norms, but also do good. But there are lots of ways to do good. Right? So I may decide to do good in this way, and you may decide to do good in that way. And thus we can have different opinions on how to do good. But we can't have different opinions on, say, the goodness of murder. Right? Another example, fourth commandment, honor your father and mother. Right? So we all have to agree we have to honor our father and mother, but we can honor them in different ways. I mean, we don't have to agree on that. But we have to agree we can't insult them or gravely neglect them. And likewise, the fourth commandment implies that we are to bring up care for our children. We can care for them in all different ways, and we can have different ideas of education for them. But we have to care for them, and we can't ever kill them. All right? So that's the difference between a prudential decision and an absolute moral norm. All right. This is the key thing to consider in casting our vote. Because if a candidate is advocating either permitting or giving taxpayer funding to something that breaks an absolute moral norm, especially in the most important matter like life and marriage, right, we can't support them, even if we agree on their prudential decisions in other matters, right, because the absolute moral norm outweighs the prudential decision. And Archbishop Lori recently spoke about this very clearly. He said, the question to ask is this: are any of the candidates of either party or independents standing for something that's intrinsically evil? Evil no matter what the circumstances. Well, if that's the case, a Catholic, regardless of party affiliation, shouldn't be voting for such a person and will be doing something immoral in doing so, because they'll be cooperating with evil. Even if you don't intend that evil. Suppose you're voting for a candidate because of some prudential decision that you agree with. And that candidate nevertheless advocates, say, unrestricted abortion or taxpayer-funded abortion. By voting for them, you're cooperating with evil in a grave matter that we all have to be united in fighting against, even though we may be legitimately in disagreement about the prudential matters. Okay? Cardinal Burke said the same thing back in 2004. He was our bishop in St. Louis, where I'm from. And he wrote this pastoral letter in 2004, but it applies today. He says, there is no element of the common good, no morally good practice that a candidate may promote and to which a voter may be dedicated, and there was no good prudential decision that could justify voting for a candidate who also endorses and supports the deliberate killing of the innocent, abortion, embryonic stem cell research, euthanasia, human cloning, or the recognition of a same-sex relationship as legal marriage. Like, those are all contrary to absolute moral norms. Right? And so we can't vote for a candidate that is in favor of those things. These elements are so fundamental to the common good that they cannot be subordinated to anything else. And so that's the end of the quote of Cardinal Burke. And here's the reason. You can't subordinate, say, the right to life to anything else. Because everything else, what's it going to be based on? Everything else we want to do is to protect the dignity of human persons. Well, how can we protect the dignity of human persons if we can eliminate them when they're most defenseless? Right? Every other thing we're going to be working for is going to be contradicted by that. And that's why it stands at the basis of the common good. Because if we're willing to say some people don't count and don't matter, how can we coherently defend everyone else's dignity? That's the key point. So voters must not vote for candidates that advocate policies that violate or permit the violation of absolute moral norms, especially in a massive way, which is what happens through legislation. And especially, they must not do so when those policies require that we cooperate through our taxes or through our healthcare policies or things like that. That's the most insidious thing. Not only to permit grave evil to be done, but to make us complicit in funding it. Right? We can't vote for a candidate who's in favor of that and comes right out and tells us that he's in favor of that. Right? And suppose somebody says, well, what if both candidates are advocating some things contrary to absolute moral norms? That's a great question. What we ought to do in that case is vote for the candidate that harms the common good less by less massively violating absolute moral norms. Right? So two candidates, suppose both support abortion, one in all circumstances and one only in some. Right? We'd have a moral obligation to vote for the candidate that wants to restrict it. Right? And it would be a grave obligation. Right? The candidate doesn't have to be perfect. That's a big mistake, to think that I can only vote for a perfect candidate. Because we want to do two things with our vote. Promote the common good and protect the common good from the greater evil. And so it could be a grave mistake to vote in a third candidate or knowing that they have no chance of being elected because neither candidate is perfect. Right? But again, that's a prudential decision that each one of us has to make. All right, let's move now to the right to life and the issue of abortion. All right, so obviously this is going to be the first of these absolute moral norms and the most important because it affects the human person in its totality. Can he come into the world at all? Right? So the Catechism of the Catholic Church tells us human life must be respected and protected absolutely from the moment of conception. And it quotes the Psalm, before I formed you in the womb, God says, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. And that's true of every human person. Just think if Our Lady had an abortion. Jesus came into the world like every other human being as a zygote, as a fetus, was dependent for 9 months. And the dignity that he came into the world with, being God made man, he's given to each one of us by shedding his blood for every person and therefore every fetus and every zygote. John Paul II is the great champion of life. When when he came to visit the United States in 1987, on leaving at the airport, he said this, quote, "That is the dignity of America, the reason she exists, the condition of her survival, yes, the ultimate test of her greatness, to respect every human person, and especially the weak and the most defenseless ones." And who are they? Those as yet unborn. Right? Unquote. Great, magnificent. No, the greatness of America, that which we all recognize makes us proud to be Americans, is precisely that commitment to defend the equal dignity of every person, no matter their condition. Well, we can't, and especially those who are most vulnerable. Well, of all Americans, who are the most vulnerable? Tragically, those still in their mother's womb. Right, so that's where we have to put the first importance. And John Paul II, I'm going to quote in a few minutes from he wrote a great encyclical on the defense of life, one of the great masterpieces called Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life. And that's a typical phrase of John Paul II. He would frequently talk about the gospel of, say, the gospel of suffering, the gospel of life. And the idea is that Christ, in becoming man and in his passion, he revealed man to himself. And therefore, he revealed human dignity to man and the value of human life. And so the gospel of life is simply the gospel. Now, before he wrote the gospel of life, he sent out a letter to all the bishops of the world. And he told the bishop of the world this. A century ago, in the late 1800s, the big moral issue for Catholic social teaching was the rights of workers. They were being oppressed in their fundamental rights with inhuman working conditions, and it was the church that courageously came to their defense. And that was what we generally call the beginning of Catholic social teaching. A great encyclical by the Pope Leo XIII called Rerum Novarum. And so John Paul II says, just as the church came to the defense of the working class a century ago, now we have to come to the defense of another class that's being even more gravely oppressed. And what class is that? The unborn. The church, he says, the church feels in duty bound to speak out with the same courage on behalf of those who have no voice. Hers, the church's, is always the evangelical cry in defense of the world's poor, those who are threatened and despised and whose human rights are violated. Right? The unborn. But also the elderly, right? With euthanasia. So in his encyclical, Evangelium Vitae, he defends it in a magnificent way. I'm going to read a little, hope this isn't too heavy. But he says, among all the crimes which can be committed against human life, procured abortion has characteristics making it particularly serious and deplorable. In other words, it's, in some sense, the gravest crime against life for various reasons. Right? Because it happens in the most sacred place, the mother's womb. Because it happens where the child is most dependent. It happens in the place of love. And it happens with the consent of the healthcare industry, whose very reason for being is to foster life. And so he goes on to say, today, in many people's consciences, right, we all know this, the perception of its gravity has become obscure. Right, that's a fact. The acceptance of abortion in the popular mind, and even in the law itself, is a telling sign of a dangerous moral crisis, which is becoming increasingly incapable of distinguishing good and evil, and of calling things by their names. And so he says, given such a grave situation, what's the first thing we have to do? We have to have the courage to look things in the eye and call things by their proper name, without yielding to convenient compromises or the temptation of self-deception. We know what he's talking about. No, instead of, we call it interruption of pregnancy, as if that would cloud the fact that that's a person being killed, right? And it's the most innocent of persons. And so he quotes the prophet Isaiah, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put forth darkness for light and light for darkness. Right? Especially in the case of abortion, there's a widespread use of ambiguous terminology. Interruption of pregnancy, et cetera, et cetera. And a good example of this was in the Obamacare legislation. You look in vain for mention of abortion, but it's there throughout, but in a concealed way. But no word has the power to change the reality of things. Procured abortion is the deliberate and direct killing. Right, she's giving a definition. What do we mean by abortion? This. Deliberate and direct killing, by whatever means it's carried out, of a human being in the initial phase of his or her existence, from conception to birth. Right? No matter what we call it, that's abortion. And its morality is apparent if we consider that it's murder, and murder of the most absolutely innocent person imaginable. Right? In no way can the fetus be considered an unjust aggressor. Right? He's totally defenseless. And then John Paul II goes on to infallibly define the grave moral evil of abortion. Right? So some people out there, even if they're Catholic politicians, they say that the church doesn't have a clear teaching on this. Right? That's totally wrong. Listen to this. Given such unanimity in the doctrinal and disciplinary tradition of the church, Paul VI, back in the 1960s, declared that this teaching is unchanged and unchangeable. Can't ever be changed. Therefore, John Paul II says, by the authority which Christ conferred on Peter and his successors. And when you hear a pope say that, by the authority that Christ conferred on Peter and his successors, and that's a sign that the pope is teaching infallibly. Right? So by the authority which Christ gave to Peter and his successors, not by my theological expertise, but by that authority that comes from Christ and he gave to Peter, in communion with all the bishops. That's why John Paul II wrote All the Bishops of the World before writing this, because he got a unanimous response from all the bishops of the world that he should do this, to define infallibly the grave moral evil of abortion. So in union with all the bishops of the world, dispersed throughout the world, who have shown unanimous agreement concerning this doctrine, I declare that direct abortion, that is, abortion willed either as an end or as a means, always constitutes a grave moral disorder, since it is the deliberate killing of an innocent human being. And this doctrine is based on natural law. It's written on our heart. And the written word of God, thou shalt not kill, and is transmitted by the church's tradition and taught by the ordinary universal magisterium, which means taught by the church century after century. Right? Period. And so that means that this can't ever be changed. Benedict can't change it. A future pope can't change it. Right? That's the nature of the authority of the Holy Father, is that people sometimes think that the infallibility of the Pope means that he can do whatever he wants. It's just the opposite. Because the Pope is infallible, he's bound by everything that his predecessors have infallibly taught. And so this is something that binds all the future popes. But it's not anything new of John Paul II. He's just simply saying, this has already been taught infallibly from the beginning. I'm just confirming it. And so we can't say, well, the church has been confused about this issue or taught different things, or we don't know what the church is teaching. Right? It's absolutely clear. All right, let's look at, now I'm going to do something controversial. Let's look at the two platforms of our major parties. Because they just came out with these two documents, and they came out with them for us. Right? So we can look at them. The Republican National Convention and Democratic National Convention draft platforms. And so let's see what they say about the right to life. All right, so I'm going to read to you from the Republican National Convention platform. It says this: faithful to the self-evident truths enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, we assert the sanctity of human life and affirm that the unborn child has a fundamental, individual right to life which cannot be infringed. That's good. That's exactly what we saw John Paul II teaching. We support a human life amendment to the Constitution. We endorse legislation to make it clear that the 14th Amendment's protections apply to unborn children. We oppose using public revenues to promote or perform abortion. Right? Because that's the worst thing, is not only is it permitted, but I'm required to pay for it. And we will not fund or subsidize health care, which includes abortion coverage. Now, I don't know if most of you know, but Obamacare is the most massive enlargement of taxpayer-funded abortion. Right? And that's been very well documented. And so that means that that legislation requires us to cooperate in funding things that are unspeakable crimes. And then it goes on to speak about other issues like euthanasia. We oppose the non-consensual withholding or withdrawal of care or treatment, including food and water, so you can't, if somebody, suppose somebody's in a coma. We don't have to do impossible, extraordinary things, but food and water is ordinary. We have to do ordinary care. We can't withhold that. And so it's nice to see here in the Republican platform an acknowledgement of that we have to give food and water to those who are gravely sick. And we oppose active and passive euthanasia and assisted suicide. And then it goes on to talk about the Born Alive Infant Protection Act. Because what happens when an infant survives an abortion? Right? You probably know that President Obama, before he became president, before he was even in the Senate, when he was a state senator in Illinois, he voted present. In other words, he didn't support legislation to protect infants who survive abortions. But those infants are human persons with the same rights as any of the rest of us. And lots of them have grown up. I mean, they are the survivors of the greatest Holocaust in American history. We call for a ban on the use of body parts from aborted fetuses for research. We support and applaud adult stem cell research, and we oppose the killing of embryos for their stem cells. In other words, adult stem cell research has no moral problems, but embryonic stem cell research is basically instrumentalizing a human person for another human person. And we can't do that, because that would be treating a human person as a pure means for the help of another person. Now, of course it's good to help another person, but you can't ever treat a human being as a pure means, because that takes away everyone's dignity. And that's the problem with embryonic stem cell research. It's a murder, because you're bringing someone into existence in a way totally contrary to God's plan. And then, for what reason? To kill them so that you can harvest their stem cells to help somebody else. And so we can't do that. And then it goes on to speak about other things like sex selection, abortion, etc. So that's the Republican platform. Let's look at the Democratic platform with regard to the right to life. It says this, I quote, "Protecting a woman's right to choose. The Democratic Party strongly and unequivocally supports Roe versus Wade and a woman's right to make decisions regarding her pregnancy, including a safe and legal abortion," and here's the key line, "regardless of the ability to pay." What does that mean? That means that you have to pay. We oppose any and all efforts to weaken or undermine that right. That means they oppose all the efforts of the states also to restrict abortion. Right? That's what the platform says. We oppose any and all efforts to weaken or undermine that right. That's pretty clear. And second point, Democrats will continue to stand up to Republican efforts to defund Planned Parenthood health centers. Well, you probably know Planned Parenthood is the largest provider of abortions. I mean, that's why we protest in front of Planned Parenthood centers. And so why would they say we will continue to stand up to all efforts to defund them? They don't just want these things to exist, right? They want what? Us to pay for them. And that's much graver because that involves everyone in cooperation with evil. And then it speaks in point number 3, praising, in his first month in office, President Obama overturned the global gag rule, a ban on federal funds to family planning organizations that provide information about, counseling on, or offer abortions. In other words, when we cast our vote doesn't just affect Americans. It affects the whole world. And that's because we give tremendous aid throughout the world. Now, when our previous president was in office, one of his first acts was stopping this. And so under President Bush, he put, that's what they call the gag rule, that federal funding wasn't to go to foreign associations that support abortion. So one of President Obama's first acts on getting into office was to overturn that. In other words, to fund not just Planned Parenthood in the United States, but throughout the world. Well, do you want to be paying for that in Latin America and in Asia and in Africa? Right? That's a really important thing. Okay, let's go on to the next point, religious liberty. Now why is religious liberty so important? It's because man's greatest dignity is the ability to know, love, and serve God. Right? Why did God make us? Baltimore Catechism 101 or any Catechism 101. He made us to know and love Him and serve Him on earth so we can be with Him forever in heaven. And therefore, the right to religious liberty is the right to do what we were made for. Right? To come to know God, to love Him, to serve Him, and to do that not just as isolated individuals, but to do that socially, because we're social creatures, and therefore to do it also publicly. And religion's ability to not just to be locked into the sanctuary, but also to have an influence in the public square, in the public life of our nation. And so every man has the right to religious liberty because he's got the duty to seek God and to seek to serve Him according to conscience. And he has that duty even if his conscience is erroneous. Right? Even if somebody thinks that the true religion is a religion different than the one that we think it is. Right? Even in such a case, that person has a duty before God to serve Him and to worship Him and to love Him as he thinks God wants to be worshipped. He might be wrong about how God wants us to worship Him, but he still has that fundamental duty to do so according to conscience. And therefore, every rightly ordered society has to protect the freedom of conscience and the freedom of religion as, again, just like the right to life, as the foundation of society. Because every society is built on the dignity of every human person, the right to life, and also on the dignity of conscience, by which we can discern right from wrong. Right? So any society, any policy that undermines the rights of conscience is the most fatal thing to that society, right? The most dangerous thing. All right, and now we all know, we've heard about it, that in recent times, especially last year, there's a great challenge to our religious liberty through the HHS mandate associated with Obamacare. And all our bishops are, thanks be to God, speaking very strongly about this. And Pope Benedict has expressed grave concern about it. So I'm just going to read you a passage from Pope Benedict. That was a talk that he gave to the U.S. bishops. The U.S. bishops go to Rome every 5 years. We call it an ad limina visit. And in January, Pope Benedict said to the U.S. bishops that came there, he said this: "Of particular concern are certain attempts being made to limit that most cherished of American freedoms, the freedom of religion. Many of you have pointed out that concerted efforts have been made to deny the right of conscientious objection on the part of Catholic individuals and institutions with regard to cooperation in intrinsically evil practices. What is he talking about? What intrinsically evil practice? Abortion. Because contraception, the pill doesn't just contracept. It has a certain percentage of the time an abortifacient effect. That means that couples that are using contraception are in fact running the risk of aborting, without having that intention, of aborting their own children. And that's especially true of the morning after pill, because that's what it's designed to do. Right? And so the HHS mandate is mandating that Catholic employers have healthcare plans for their employees that include things that are abortifacient. In other words, cause abortions. All right, well, that's cooperation in grave evil. And basically, the administration is requiring Catholic institutions to provide such things or pay a tremendous fine that will put them, in effect, out of business. And I think that's the real objective. Why? Because I'm going to get to that as the next point in the talk. But I think part of the objective here is to get the Catholic Church out of the healthcare business, out of charities, so that something else can take its place. So what would that be? Government, the state. Right? And that would be catastrophic. To whom? To the people served, right? First of all, to the poor, to the needy, to the sick, etc. All right, so let's go back to Pope Benedict. So Benedict says, many of you have pointed out that concerted efforts are being made to deny the right of conscientious objection on the part of Catholic individuals and institutions with regard to cooperation in intrinsically evil practices. Others have spoken to me of a worrying tendency to reduce religious freedom to mere freedom of worship without guarantees of respect for freedom of conscience. What does that mean? Pope Benedict is saying that there's a danger that the government is going to say, all right, you've got freedom of worship. Here's the church. You can go in there and worship. We're not going to bother you when you're inside the church. But we don't want a Catholic presence in the public square. That's the danger. That's why the administration often uses the terms, prefers the terms freedom of worship to freedom of religion. Because freedom of religion is broader in that sense. Freedom of religion isn't just our freedom to worship inside the church, but it's also our freedom to speak before the world and to do charitable works as Catholics and to educate as Catholics and to do healthcare as Catholics. And the same goes for any other religious organization, right? And that's essential to the well-being of our nation, that every religious group has that freedom. Right? So this is not a small thing. And it's a pattern. If you know history, you know that there's a long history of this. Just across our borders in Mexico, most people are ignorant of this, but in the early 20th century, in the 1920s and 30s, there was a horrific persecution of the Catholic Church in Mexico. And what the government did was say, well, we've got freedom of religion. We've got freedom of worship. You can go into your church and worship. It's just the state's going to control what you say outside of church. And even the pastoral letters that you read in church, the state's got to sign off on. All right, we haven't gotten there yet. But we ought to see a tendency. We ought to see a direction that would be catastrophic for our country. And of course, communism did it better, that kind of thing, right? In the Soviet Union, their constitution said, well, we've got freedom of religion. It's just controlled by the state. Okay. Cardinal Dolan has said some great things about this. He says, simply put, government has no business interfering in the internal life of the soul, my conscience, or the church. All right, let's look at our two platforms on this regard. All right, what does the Republican National Convention platform say? It says this, quote, "The most offensive instance of this war on religion has been the current administration's attempt to compel faith-related institutions, Catholic Church, as well as believing individuals, suppose you have a small business, right? It's the same thing, to impose on them, to compel them to contravene, to go against their deeply held religious, moral, or ethical beliefs regarding health services, traditional marriage, or abortion. This forcible secularization of religious and religiously affiliated organizations, like the Catholic Church, but also small businesses, other things, including faith-based hospitals and colleges, has been in tandem, has gone together with the current administration's audacity in declaring which faith-related activities are or are not protected by the First Amendment. And so we all know that the administration made an exception. So, okay, we're not going to force every religious organization to follow the HHS mandate. It's just that in order to qualify, you have to basically do things that isn't real. Because one of the conditions was that you would only be serving Catholics. Right? So if an organization that only employed Catholics and only served Catholics, all right, they could be exempt. But if you also served anyone who came to you, then you wouldn't be exempt. Well, what right does the government have to define a religious organization as one which only serves their own? Didn't Jesus say something about go out to all nations and preach the gospel? And to serve, right? Without asking who you are. All right, what about so that's the Republican platform, and it goes on. We pledge to respect the religious beliefs and rights of conscious full Americans and to safeguard the independence of their institutions from government. We support the public display of the Ten Commandments. Because think about that. The Ten Commandments is at the foundation of every civil society because it's simply the fundamental respect for the human person. The right to life, the right to respect to marriage, property, and reputation. So why wouldn't we want to honor that? So we support the public display of the Ten Commandments as a reflection of our history and of our country's Judeo-Christian heritage. And you won't find that in the other platform. And we affirm the right of students to engage in prayer public school events and to have equal access to public schools and other public facilities. All right, what about the Democratic National Convention platform? Well, it mentions religious liberty once, but in what context? Precisely the HHS mandate, and says this: the Affordable Care Act, that's Obamacare, ensures that women have access to contraception in their health insurance plans, and the president has respected the principle of religious liberty. Right, so that's what it says about religious liberty. It says religious liberty is something that we respect. Why? Because we've allowed these exemptions. Oh, well, that's not good enough. In fact, it's just the opposite, right? It's basically saying the only context in which I mention religious liberty is where I'm taking it away from you. And so what's the probable outcome if this goes unchallenged and doesn't get overturned? It could mean the potential closure of a great number of Catholic institutions. Right? This is really serious. Because the government would be making them choose between violating their conscience, paying massive fines that may make them non-competitive or close down, or directly closing down. Right? Those are the three choices. And the first is one that we cannot choose. So that's how serious it is. And who will suffer? Not just Catholics, but all those who are served. Let's go on to the defense of marriage. Right. Together with the right to life and religious liberty, marriage is at the center of every society because every human being comes into the world through, every human being is designed by God to come into the world through love, in a context in which the child can learn love by seeing parents who are bound together in a covenant of love. And so God's plan for the transmission of life is of huge importance. And it's importance because it's about love. And God wants the human person to be the fruit of a love that has the properties of God's love. Right? That it be faithful totally, and that means for life. That it be complementary. Complementary with a man and a woman. And what's so beautiful about complementarity is that each one gives what the other can't give. Right? In complementarity, there's a union of two in which each one has something irreplaceable. Right? There's the maternal love and a paternal love, and they're not the same. And it's good that they're not the same, because it means that each one has a special gift that can't be replaced. Right? And so that's part of God's plan for the human person, that he learn love in a cradle of love. And that's why changing, say, the definition of marriage isn't a small thing for a society. It's not simply a matter of getting political points or making some kind of political calculations, right? Because it's at the heart of the passing on of the greatest treasure, human life. All right, let's look at the two platforms. Democratic platform. We support marriage equality and support the movement to secure equal treatment under law for same-sex couples. In other words, we support gay marriage. The Republican National Convention, and it goes on and on. The Republican National Convention says this. It's speaking about the dangers of an activist judiciary. In other words, the courts that redefine marriage. And it says, quote, a blatant example has been the court-ordered redefinition of marriage in several states. This is more than a matter of warring legal concepts and ideals. It is an assault on the foundations of our society. And that's absolutely right. Challenging the institution which, for thousands of years, in virtually every civilization, has been entrusted with the rearing of children and the transmission of cultural values. We affirm our support for a constitutional amendment defining marriage as the union of one man and one woman. We applaud the citizens of the majority of states which have enshrined in their constitutions the traditional concept of marriage. Right? The parties couldn't be farther apart on this issue. All right, let's look at helping the poor. Because a lot of times I think people think, all right, I grant you on all those issues that you've mentioned, and it's pretty clear. But helping the poor, it seems that the pendulum has gone the other way, that the other party would have the advantage there. And I think there are a lot of organizations like Catholics for Obama, et cetera, that present helping the poor as if the Catholic social teaching was an endorsement of the democratic platform. All right, so let's look at that. So the idea goes that while the Republicans might be ahead on the life issues, and the Democrats are ahead on the poverty issues. I think we've all heard that presented. And I think a tremendous number of Catholic voters are casting their vote based on that kind of consideration. Because the statistics tell us that Catholics are pretty evenly divided. And if anything, it seems lately they've been swinging the past month towards Obama. All right, so two things. First, and what we started with at the beginning, how to help. Everyone agrees we should help the poor. I don't think anybody is denying solidarity. Right? So all the different parties are in favor of some kind of solidarity. But we disagree on what are the means to do so. All right, what kind of a decision is that? That's a prudential decision. And we said that good people can disagree on those questions. All right, so that's the first one. Secondly, it's not true that Catholic social teaching favors an ever bigger welfare state. It's exactly the contrary. Catholic social teaching has consistently, for the past 100 years, come out very strongly with this principle. When we want to help those who are needy, where should the help be given? at the most local level possible and the most personal level possible. Why? Because, well, for two reasons. First, because the person will be better helped that way. Because what do people want most of all when they're in need? They want to be treated like a person. They want to be respected. They want to be seen as with a face and not be treated as a number. And so when we help people, it's best that help be given at the local level through local initiatives, because that helps that person. First of all, by seeing them as a person. Secondly, it makes for accountability. Because suppose I'm being helped by somebody whose face I see. And I know the sacrifices that they're making to help me. I'm going to be much more inclined to want to get back on my feet as quickly as possible, so I don't need to continue receiving the sacrificial aid of a person that I know. Whereas if I just get a check in the mail from the government, what do people think? Well, it's not costing any particular person, and therefore it leaves us unaccountable. Right? It leaves when we get anonymous aid or government aid. Right? So that's one part of it. The second part of it is no less important. It's that when aid is given, not from the bottom up, but from the top down, what happens? When all aid is given from the top down, the local level gets crushed. It's the local level, say the family first of all, right? So what is the local level? The family is the first local level. And then local associations like the parish, local charities, and groups that are grassroots, in other words, that come up from below. The church has always been the most important. Church is an association that helps the needy. Right? And so if it's coming down from the top down instead of from the bottom up, those societies get pushed out of the way. The family and the church. Right? And that's not good for anyone. It's not good for the person being helped. And it's not at all good for the family and for the parish and the church itself. Let's look at what the popes had said about this. All right, we call this principle, sorry for the difficult word, subsidiarity. And it comes from a Latin word, subsidium, which means aid. And the principle, what it's about is how should we best aid people who are in need? Right? We could call it the aid principle. And so how should we do it? At the most local level possible. All right, sometimes it can't be done at the most local level, then a higher level. But you want it to be the most local level possible, where the aid is given. All right, national defense. We can't do that, right? National defense shouldn't be me protecting my family with a gun. But other things are best done in the family. Deciding what education my child ought to have. Right? I don't want the government deciding that. Because God gave who that responsibility? The parents. So Pope Benedict has written a recent encyclical on Catholic social teaching, a great encyclical, called Caritas in Veritate, charity in truth. In other words, how to do charity right. How to do charity in the truth of the human person. And he says this, quote, "The state which would provide everything, absorbing everything into itself," does that sound familiar? "Would ultimately become a mere bureaucracy, incapable of guaranteeing the very thing that the suffering person, every person, needs. Namely, loving personal concern. We do not need a state which regulates and controls everything, but a state which, in conformity with this principle, subsidiarity, generously acknowledges and supports initiatives arising from the different social forces and combines spontaneity with closeness to those in need." Right? From the bottom up. And that's how the Holy Spirit works, from the bottom up, not from the top down. Right? So the principle of subsidiarity says that the state in aiding members of society, must not usurp, must not take to itself what can be accomplished competently by families, by smaller associations, depriving them of their proper freedom of action in their own sphere. Higher levels, such as local government or federal government, should aid families, right? So what should the best way to aid the poor is to aid families and smaller associations, so that those smaller associations can directly have a personal contact. So the government can aid those smaller associations, but without taking their place, right? Without becoming Big Brother. And so we could say there are two principles, solidarity and subsidiarity. Solidarity is that, remember Cain and Abel. God asked Cain, where's Abel, your brother? What does Cain say? Am I my brother's keeper? Answer, yes, you are. Okay, absolutely you are. So that's solidarity. We're in this together. But subsidiarity tells us how to do it. How do we exercise solidarity? Not delegating it to the government, but doing it ourselves. See, it's really, in very many ways, you can see why people would prefer delegating it to the government. Because it placates your conscience at the least personal initiative. Somebody else is going to take care of it. Right? I just pay my taxes. But what the person next to me wants is more than I pay my taxes and big government takes care of it. So Pope Benedict speaks of subsidiarity as a form of assistance to the human person through intermediate societies, through smaller societies. And it always aims at emancipating the person it helps. This is so important. Right? When aid is given, you want to help the person to become independent and not give perverse incentives for them to lose their independence. And so I think a good case, and I haven't done the statistical surveys necessary, but I think we could make a good case that the Great Society program of the 1960s, I don't know if some of you remember Lyndon Johnson, great intention, war on poverty. But a result of those policies was increased poverty. Why? Because aid was given making perverse incentives. We'll give more aid to, say, a single mother than we would to one who's married. Well, that's a bad idea, because you're making a perverse incentive for the man to leave, because his child will get more money. And it led, I think one could argue statistically, to the breakdown of the family structure in our inner cities. Right? So it's not enough to have a good intention, I want to help the poor through big government, because you may be destroying the very people that you want to help. Right? So, conclusion. Also on this issue, a bigger government platform doesn't win out. Right? So for helping the poor, I think the best way that we do this is endorsing a party that endorses subsidiarity, helping from the bottom up. In other words, putting policies into place that encourage families and associations and businesses and churches and religious orders, etc., to do that, and not the government. And I could go on, but I'm not going to. A whole string of popes, from Leo XIII, back in the 1890s, to Pius XI in the 1930s, at the time of the Great Depression. He wrote a magnificent social encyclical, and he speaks there about subsidiarity. He says, just as it is gravely wrong to take from individuals what they can accomplish by their own initiative, right, that would be communism, and give it to the community, so also it is an injustice and a grave evil and a disturbance of right order to assign to a greater and higher association, say the federal government, what lesser and subordinate organizations can do. And those are strong words. He says it is an injustice and a grave evil when that happens, right? When the government takes over what we ought to be doing. And then John Paul II, in Centesimus Annus, the encyclical he wrote when the Berlin Wall fell in 1991, he speaks at length about what he calls the social welfare state. And he doesn't speak positively about it. He says, malfunctions and defects in the social welfare state are the result of not rightly understanding what the state ought to do. The principle of subsidiarity must be respected. A community of a higher order should not interfere in the internal life of a community of a lower order, but should support it. By intervening directly and depriving society of its responsibility, the social assistance state, the social welfare state, leads to a loss of human energies and an inordinate increase of public agencies, which are dominated more and more by bureaucratic ways of thinking than by concern for serving their clients, simply by the necessity of this separation. And an enormous increase in spending. Right? I mean, he's writing this 20 years ago, but how much it applies to us today. And one last thing. When the government takes over all these things, not only are the poor hurt, but the government gets too much power. And this goes back to the first things we said. When government takes over all the helping business, it's going to impose its own ideology. And thus, the right to life and religious freedom are going to be increasingly violated. Right? So kind of all these points go together. All right. It's up to us to make our decision. But given this, this is what ought to inform